Last year, individuals from this club have been working, thinking of ideas of how to raise the spiritual climate on this campus. So what we mean by that is, how can we give each student here at McMaster the opportunity to explore their spirituality in an unbiased way? So for the last 2 weeks, dozens and dozens of Mac students have been working to put this thing together, to advertise it out there, and that's how you guys all came out here today. And I think I speak for everyone when I say that we're delighted that everyone's out here today, and we really hope that you're having a good time. So what is the conflict? Well, what is conflict? One definition is that two ideas, each claim to be true and are mutually exclusive, and these two ideas are in conflict. Another way to put it, each one of us holds certain beliefs that we hold to ourselves, and ideas that may or may not be the same as the person next to us to the left or to our right. But today's postmodern culture kind of dictates to us considering that each person's ideas are equally valid or equally important. But does that mean that everyone's ideas are equally correct? And that's for ourselves to decide. Tonight's Jesus Conflict is the last of a three-part series where we've been discussing some of the conflicting ideas in our culture. So some ideas or questions that we were thinking about today. What is the last prophet? Who was the last prophet? Who is Jesus Christ? What did he do? What did he say? What were his claims? And most importantly of all, were his claims legitimate? Can we believe in them? As I'm sure most of us are aware, the implications of this informal debate tonight are gigantic, and they go back to the very origins of Christianity and Islam, two of the most influential ideologies in our culture today. The purpose of tonight's debate is to address these conflicts and beliefs. So I'm pleased to say that tonight we bring to you two of Canada's leading religious scholars who will be presenting to us each side of the argument. On my right, we have Imam Shabir Ali. Shabir Ali holds a bachelor's degree in religious studies from the University of Laurentian with a specialization in biblical literature. He also has a master's from the University of Toronto in religious studies, specializing in Quranic exegesis. He's now completing his PhD studies also in Quranic exegesis at U of T. Imam Ali is the president of the Islamic Information and Dawah Center International in Toronto, where he functions as Imam. He travels internationally to represent Islam in public lectures and interfaith dialogues. He also explains Islam on a weekly television program called Let the Quran Speak. On my left side, we have here Reverend Tony Costa, who will be representing the Christian side of the topic. Reverend Costa has earned a bachelor's and master's degree in religious studies from the University of Toronto and is now completing his PhD at the University of Pretoria in South America in New Testament studies. He's a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, the Evangelical Theological Society, and the Evangelical Philosophical Society. So Mr. Costa will be, he frequently lectures in various churches throughout Ontario and has been a guest on television programs such as Harry Huntley Street, the Michael Corn Live Show, and On the Line with Christine Williams. Last of all, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening. His name is Kozo Ota, the Vice President of Mac Debate Society, and Kozo will be explaining to us the rules and structure of the debate.
Thank you, Charles. Can everyone hear me without the microphone? Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you, Charles. As you said, I'm the Vice President for Mac Debate, and I will be the impartial moderator for this debate. Tonight, the format is quite simple. The two debaters, Reverend Costa and Imam Ali, have agreed on a format. And Reverend Costa will first speak for 15 minutes to give his opening statement and arguments. And then Imam Ali will then have 15 minutes to present his own arguments and opening statements. Following those two 15 remarks, Reverend Costa will speak for 7 minutes to rebut points brought up by the Imam and also just further his argument. Imam Ali will have the opportunity to do the same in a 7-minute speech right after. Finally, after the two 7-minute speeches, there will be 5-minute closing arguments by both sides, once again with the Reverend speaking first and the Imam at the end. That will be the formal portion of the debate, and I will be giving time signals from my seat up front. Be holding up signs with 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds left, and also a big sign that says stop after all the time has elapsed. I won't be too firm on that. The debaters will have a chance to finish their sentence and thoughts before I come up and introduce the next speaker. After the formal portion of the debate, we'll be going into a Q&A session that will allow the audience to ask questions of the debaters, but we'll explain the format of that once we get to that point. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, the Reverend Costa, to open this round of debate and 15-minute presentation.
Good evening, everyone, and Pretoria is actually South Africa. In case we had some South Africans out there. Okay, you're bad, right? Okay. Well, thank you so much for giving me the honor and the pleasure to be here this evening and to share with you on who is Jesus. And also, we're going to be looking primarily at the resurrection of Jesus, and we're asking the question as well tonight, did Jesus rise from the dead? The identity of Jesus is one that has provoked thought through the centuries. Jesus of Nazareth himself asked the question, who do men say that I am? He also asked that question point blankly of his disciples, who do you say that I am? And scholarship has reached somewhat of a consensus on the historical Jesus, that the historical Jesus appeared in the first century with a very unique message and a unique ministry. He claimed to speak in the place of God. He believed that in his person the kingdom of God was present, and he demonstrated the presence of that kingdom through a ministry of healings and exorcisms. But the question is, did Jesus conceive of himself as the Son of God? And when we were at the University of Waterloo, we dealt with that question a little more closely. And scholars have looked at a number of passages from the New Testament, a number of sayings that are considered to be authentic sayings of the historical Jesus. I just want to quickly enumerate them for you on the screen. You have a reading there from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, 1 to 8. This is the parable of the wicked tenants in the vineyard. And in this parable, Jesus talks about how a man planted a vineyard. The man, of course, in this parable is God. And he sent out servants or slaves to collect the rent from the people to whom this vineyard was being leased to. And in this story, the servants that are sent here are the prophets. The prophets were sent to these people. Some of them were misused, some were abused, some were killed. And then finally, if you notice in verse 6 there, finally the owner sends his own son, his own beloved son, saying, surely they will respect my beloved son. And the son here, of course, is an allusion to Jesus. And he distinguishes himself from these prophets in that while they are servants, he comes in the capacity of son. And this saying is considered a genuine saying of the historical Jesus. The next passage I want to bring your attention to is found in both Matthew 11 and Luke 10. Scholars believe that Matthew and Luke here are quoting from an earlier source known as Q, the Q document, which was a saying source that circulated prior to the writing down of the Gospels, datable to about 50 of the Common Era. And you will notice in this passage here that you have language that is not typically the language you find in the Synoptic Gospels. This is typically Johannine language. But yet in this passage, Jesus talks about no one knows the Father but the Son. No one knows the Son but the Father. And the Son reveals him to whoever he wishes. And notice there's a close, intimate relationship here between Father and Son. And that as the Son, Jesus reveals the Father to whomsoever he wishes. Now again, this is considered an authentic saying of the historical Jesus, which goes to show that once again, we have a filial consciousness. That is, Jesus did see himself as the Son, the beloved Son of God. And finally, in Mark 13, we have a passage here which also is considered authentic. Jesus is speaking about the time of the end. And in this remarkable statement, he says that of that day and hour, the day of his advent, he says, no one knows, neither the angels nor the Son, but only the Father. And I want you to notice that we have what's called a criterion of embarrassment here. That is that Christians generally would not want to write things that would be embarrassing to their case. Why would you have Jesus speak in this fashion when it imputes ignorance to him? He doesn't know the time of the end. So this is generally taken as a bona fide, authentic saying of the historical Jesus. But notice how he uses the ascending scale. Man, angels, and the Son as being the closest to the Father. And based on this, many scholars believe Jesus did, the historical Jesus did see himself in a unique position as Son of God. But calling him the Son of God or calling anybody a prophet, anyone can claim to be a prophet, talk is cheap, as the adage goes. There is something much more to this. The Christian movement did not find its origins on the birth of Jesus or the claims of Jesus or the ministry of Jesus. It had its genesis in something we call the resurrection. And this resurrection is really the bedrock, the foundation of all Christianity. In fact, we're told by Paul in Romans 1, 3-4, Paul is quoting here, many scholars believe, a creed that he got from the first Christians, and it goes like this. The gospel concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by resurrection from the dead. He goes on to say in 1 Corinthians 15, and if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God, for we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, you are still in your sins. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Now, the resurrection of Jesus is considered by virtually all scholars as the bedrock of the Christian movement. Professor Bart Ehrman states, quote, "It is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his execution." Now, there are 5 basic points that I want to advance tonight that are generally agreed upon scholars as rooted in history. 5 basic points about the historical Jesus. The first one is the death of Jesus by crucifixion. The late Robert Funk, the chair of the Jesus Seminar, stated that there is one indisputable fact that we know about the historical Jesus, namely that he was executed by crucifixion. Professor Raymond Brown goes on to point in his massive work, The Death of the Messiah, Volume 1, quote, "Historically, Jesus' death was the most public moment of his life," close quote. Now you have to realize that the death of Jesus would have served as a fatal death blow to the Messianic movement that he started. Messianic movements, according to N.T. Wright, usually began this way. They were revolutionary, they were militant, they were trying to overthrow the Roman yoke. And when the Messianic leader died, the movement either dissipated or they joined another leader. But in the case of Jesus, what do we find? He is dead. His disciples are in hiding. There's chaos. They're hiding for fear of the religious leaders. But then something happens. They change. They become bold proclaimers of this crucified Messiah, which in the Jewish mind was an oxymoron. A crucified Messiah was a cursed Messiah. But the resurrection reversed that for the early Christians. Point number 2, the honorable burial of Jesus. All scholars believe that the burial tradition that we find in the Gospels are rooted in very, very good historical attestation. Take, for example, John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, who stated that the honorable burial of Jesus is, quote, "the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus," close quote. Rudolf Bultmann, the very noted critic of the New Testament, also stated that the burial of Jesus was founded on very good historical attestation. You will also notice, according to James D.D. Junn, that there is an absence of the veneration of the tomb of Jesus. The Jews had the tendency to mark the graves of holy men and rabbis, and they would make it a place of pilgrimage where they would go and venerate the bones of the holy people. You will notice that you don't find this in the New Testament or in early Christian history. You don't find Christians venerating the tomb of Jesus, precisely because, as James D.T. Junn points out, the tomb was empty. And this brings me to my third point. The empty tomb discovery. We have the death of Jesus, his honorable burial. Thirdly, on the 3rd day following his execution, a number of his women disciples discovered that his tomb was empty. Now, you have to realize in a first century setting, this is a precarious statement to make. For women to find the tomb empty was virtually to shoot yourself in the foot. Women had absolutely no legal status as witnesses in first century Judaism. We find that in Josephus and in other Jewish sources. But yet here they are in 4 gospel accounts discovering the empty tomb. Now, the fact of the matter is this. Historians agree that the tomb was empty. The Austrian specialist on the resurrection, Professor Jacob Kramer, points out, by far, most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements concerning the empty tomb. Professor D.H. Van Dalen points out, it is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who deny it do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. Number 4, another event that is rooted in history is what we call the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, or the post-Easter appearances. That is, his early disciples experienced appearances of the risen Jesus, where he came to them in different locations. He appeared to individuals. He appeared to groups of people. At one time, he appeared to 500 people at once. He appeared to enemies like Saul of Tarsus, skeptics like his brother James. And he appeared to people like Simon Peter, the lead disciple. Professor Gerd Ludemann points out, and he is a very sharp critic of the New Testament with no invested interest in Christianity, he points out, quote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences of Jesus in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ." Now, he may explain it away as he does as a hallucination, but one thing is certain, they did experience something. The evidence points in that direction. And finally, the fifth point. When we take points 1, 2, and 3, and 4, this brings us to a position where you have what's called the origin of the Christian way. And this is where the Christian movement gets its beginnings, its genesis. Throughout the New Testament, there is twin focal points. The twin focal points of the New Testament are based on the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And this was the content of what the early Christians called the gospel. That is the good news about Jesus, what God had done in Jesus of Nazareth. Professor Luke Johnson of Emory University states, quote, "Some sort of powerful transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement early as Christianity was." N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, says, quote, "That is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him." The other thing we have to realize is that the resurrection of Jesus is a falsifiable point. What I mean by that is, when the disciples were preaching that Jesus had been raised from the dead by God, what they were preaching was a bodily resurrection. That is, that his body was raised. That's why you have an empty tomb. Therefore, the resurrection is falsifiable. But one way to falsify the resurrection claim is to produce the body. Now, an unfalsifiable argument would go like this. If someone said, well, Jesus simply went to heaven. His soul assumed and was ascended into heaven, or his spirit went to be with God in paradise. You can't prove that one way or another. That is an unfalsifiable argument. But what we have in early Christianity is something that can be falsified. And yet, what do we find? We find the absence of the evidence. The religious leaders cannot produce the body of Jesus of Nazareth. And when they were pressed to prove the empty tomb, what they said was there was a theft. They came in the night and they stole the body and they ran off with it and they declared the resurrection. Notice that this protest does not deny the reality of the empty tomb. It simply tries to explain it away. Now, what is the best hypothesis to explain the resurrection of Jesus? Well, through the years, there have been alternate theories that have arisen. Some have speculated maybe we have an apparent death. We have a swoon theory. Jesus didn't really die. He was rendered unconscious and he was brought down from the cross. They thought he was dead and he revived in the cool of the tomb and he showed himself to his disciples. No scholar seriously holds to this view any longer. In fact, as far back as 1835, David Friedrich Strauss, who wrote in his book Das Leben Jesu, The Life of Jesus, one of the earliest Jewish Jesus scholars, he points out, and again, he has no vested interest in Christianity. He didn't believe in the resurrection either. He just said the swoon theory is not a sufficient reason to explain the rise of early Christianity. How can this Nazarene carpenter go from being a crucified criminal on a cross to being the risen Lord, the risen Christ who was worshipped by the early Christians? You can't get that from an apparent death theory or a swoon theory. You have other theories, such as the wrong tomb theory, that the women went to the wrong tomb and it happened to be empty. And therefore they went about preaching that Jesus was raised from the dead. This theory also has been dismissed summarily by New Testament scholarship. One of my favorite theories is the view propounded by a professor down in Berkeley who said that Jesus had a twin brother who was separated at birth. And then on Passover weekend, when Jesus was executed, his brother decided to come for the feast, went to the tomb, heard what happened, went to the tomb, threw his body out, appeared to the disciples, and they thought it was Jesus risen again. It was his identical twin. Now, again, suffice it to say, virtually no scholar holds to this. There may be one scholar out there who holds to that, but again, this is just a naturalistic explanation to avoid or to explain away the empty tomb. I have no problem suggesting tonight the hypothesis that I think the early Christians got it right. I think that their testimony that God raised this Jesus from the dead is the best hypothesis to explain what happened. I come to the text tonight also as a believer, not as someone who wants to tear apart Holy Scripture, but I come here as someone who does believe that there is a God who has the ability to raise the dead. And I believe that this was the case with the historical Jesus. Now, we need some arguments, and Imam Ali will present his tonight, but we need some evidence to show what happened. We have the death of Jesus. We have his burial. We have his post-mortem appearances. We have the origin of the Christian way. And we have to explain how the resurrection language that the disciples used came about. Why did they call it resurrection? We have to explain the empty tomb. And we also have to explain the fact that all the Gospels maintain one thing, that Jesus died. And they use the actual phrase, he breathed his last, he gave up his spirit. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Reverend Costa for his remarks and call upon the Imam Ali to open his case.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Tony, for that very exciting and informative presentation. I'd like to begin by praising and thanking our Creator and for the fact that He brought us together tonight in such an amiable atmosphere in which we can explore some of the things that are important for us in this life and also eternally for our salvation forever. Did Jesus rise from the dead, and who exactly is Jesus? The New Testament makes it very clear that if Jesus did not in fact rise from the dead, then the entire Christian faith is vain, and in that case Jesus is nothing other than an ordinary man. From the Quranic perspective, the resurrection of Jesus is not important for the position and status of Jesus. He is, regardless of whether he rose from the dead or not, as a Messiah, a prophet, a messenger of God, one who was born of Mary, whom Muslims believed to have been a virgin at the time. Jesus, according to the Quran, performed many miraculous deeds. He was a true man of God. God raised him to himself, the Quran says, and Muslims believe that before the end of all time, Jesus will return. So our question tonight does not decide for a Muslim whether or not Jesus was a true Messiah. The Quran for Muslims is the Word of God, and a Muslim could not be a Muslim without believing in Jesus. However, we do have the peculiarity that from the New Testament documents, it is clear that if Jesus did not rise from the dead, well then he is nothing. And a Muslim is now at a dilemma. A Muslim can continue believing in the Quran as the Word of God and continue to believe in Jesus on that basis. But our Christian friends say to us, you shouldn't believe in the Quran because this came much later than Jesus. We should believe in the New Testament documents. In order for us to do that, that means we have to first of all suspend our belief in Jesus as we have believed as Muslims. We have to come now neutral, fresh, and understand the material all over again, and ask the basic question, how do we know that Jesus rose from the dead? In our debate tonight, there is an affirmative and a negative position. The affirmative responsibility is to show evidence and fact, give good arguments to show that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. And the negative position only has to show that that argument does not really work. In which case, we should not presume a man who lived some 2,000 years ago to have resurrected from the dead. We should just simply presume him to have died and perhaps been buried, even missing, but presumed dead, as the millions of people have been. We have no reason for suspecting or presuming that a certain person who lived 2,000 years ago has actually risen from the dead. So if we now look at the New Testament documents with both eyes, as Tom Wright, the eminent New Testament scholar from the other side of the Atlantic, tells us we should do, well then what do we notice? The way to read the Gospels properly and thoroughly, for all their worth, is actually to compare the episodes that are reported in the across the Gospels. So you go to Mark's Gospel, you read an episode there, and you put your finger on the page, and then go to Matthew and Luke, and see how Matthew and Luke have rewritten the story that was already once appearing in Mark, and see what they have done with the story. And then go also to John's Gospel and see if a similar story does exist there. Often it doesn't, but often it does. Then see how John has in fact reworked the story as well. And I promise you that you will notice that episode for episode, the general trend that will prevail is that the later the gospel, the more it tries to prove that Jesus really died on the cross, and the more it tries to prove that Jesus really did reappear to his disciples alive after he was once dead. The later the gospel, the more witnesses the gospel brings close to the cross to observe what was happening, and closer to the cross than they have ever been, the more people witness the appearance of Jesus after he has apparently or presumably resurrected from the dead. And we can tell from this general trend, not by looking at one episode, by knowing this to be a general trend, that the Gospels have to be read in a certain way backwards. We have to say that this is how the story has been evolving over time, and the truth of the matter is actually something that is even predating these Gospels. So what then would be the truth of the story? Let me give you an example of what happened. Last night in Guelph, I argued against Tony's 5 indisputable points, that at least one of the points is heavily disputable. The question as to whether or not Jesus really died on the cross. And I've shown that the later the Gospel, the more the Gospel goes out of its way to prove that Jesus actually did die on the cross. For example, in the 4th Gospel, we have the spear thrust in the side of Jesus, which for many would decide the issue. It looks like this is the nail in the coffin that makes the man finally dead. But that's only in the Gospel according to John, and historians and scholars of the New Testament generally agree that John has introduced this for theological reasons. They do not think it is a historical fact that the side of Jesus was thrust with a spear like this. Moreover, if we look at the Synoptic Gospels, the first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what we do find is that these Gospels show that from the 6th hour to the 9th hour there was darkness throughout the land. Now, you must imagine, Jesus is there on the cross, according to these Gospels, and for 3 hours straight, before he finally dies, there is darkness throughout the land. Now, what will happen when there is darkness throughout the land? The Gospels do not tell us, but you might start to imagine. If this was an episode of 24, your TV would break up into 4 screens, and in one screen you would find the Roman governor Pilate wondering, what should we do to bring the lights back on? And his wife would come approaching him and remind him, see, I told you, have nothing to do with this man because I've been seeing nightmares with regards to this man. You shouldn't have done anything wrong to this man. In another corner, you would have the Jewish scholars gathering together and wondering, what have we done wrong? For 3 hours straight, nobody wonders and bothers why there is darkness throughout the land. Why are the Gospels silent about this? But more to my point, if there was this 3 hours darkness throughout the land, would anyone following this dare to do anything further to Jesus? Would anyone want to approach him and thrust his side with a spear? More than this, Matthew's Gospel says that at the time when Jesus expired, when he said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? At that time, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. There was a huge earthquake. The rocks split. The tombs were opened. And the saints, who were already dead and buried, have now come back to life. And after the resurrection, they went into the city and appeared to many people. Matthew has some vagueness here. What happened to the saints after they came back alive? And from that time to the time they went into the city and appeared to the people, did they remain in their graves, laying there alive, but waiting for Jesus to resurrect first? It is not very clear. But what would have been clear to all of the onlookers is that there is cosmic cataclysm here entering because of the death of Jesus. At that point, would anyone dare to approach Jesus and thrust his side with a spear? But this is precisely the point at which John's Gospel has the spear thrust introduced into the story. So we can tell that this is an invention into the story. It is not an original part of the story about Jesus and how he died on the cross. But you can see my point. The later the Gospel, the more they try to eliminate any doubt that Jesus died on the cross, and the more they try to fix the fact that he died on the cross, even by inventing episodes into this story. Mark's Gospel shows that when Pilate was approached to have the body taken down and given a decent burial, Pilate was amazed that Jesus could have died so soon. Why would he be amazed? Because usually crucifixion took several days to kill a person, and Jesus, by the accounts of the Gospels, was only on the cross for a few hours. No wonder he was amazed. Matthew and Luke, who based their stories upon Mark, according to Raymond Brown, a preeminent scholar in the New Testament who passed away just recently, says that Matthew and Luke, though basing their stories upon Mark's initial narrative, in rewriting the story for their own Gospels, eliminated mention of the doubt that Pilate had. Why? He thinks because Matthew and Luke do not want that readers of their Gospels should entertain the same doubt which readers of Mark's Gospel would have been entertaining. Because the moment you think about Pilate having that doubt, you start having it too. You wonder, what would have killed Jesus? And Raymond Brown himself asks in the appendix to his 2-volume work on the death of the Messiah, what would have been the physiological cause of the death of our Lord. And he says that this remains a question because crucifixion does not pierce any vital organ. So finally, what caused the death of Jesus? And how do you know that Jesus actually died on the cross? What if he was taken down alive from the cross and he finally died in the tomb? In this case, he didn't die on the cross taking the sins of all humanity at that moment. And Christian theology is actually resting upon a mistake. And you can understand why the gospel writers want to insist that he died on the cross, even by inventing stories to that effect. Another point of Tony's 5 indisputable facts is that he reappeared. Jesus reappeared to his disciples after he was once known to be dead. But is that an indisputable fact? When we read the gospel narratives that try to prove this, again you have that the later the gospel, the more such occasions you read, and the more people are privy to this reappearance of Jesus. And again, you have to read it backwards and ask what must have been the truth of the matter. Raymond Brown, in his 2-volume commentary on John's Gospel, which is part of the Anchor series, examines all of these narratives, and he comes to the conclusion that whereas we can find, for example, in John's Gospel that there are more than one occasions when Jesus appears to the 12, the original disciples, in fact, there was only one appearance that now became several stories. And the initial appearance that would have been remembered in the earliest churches would not have been one that had all of the physical elements, where, for example, Jesus comes in and they can feel and touch him. It must, some scholars have thought, that the initial appearance that the disciples experienced would have been not a hallucination, as Gerd Ludemann has said, but would have been a revelation from God. Of course, skeptics would say this was a hallucination. But Muslims do not have any difficulty in thinking that after Jesus was taken up alive by God, God, in order to pacify the disciples, would have shown them a revelation of Jesus. That may have been something similar to what Stephen saw. Although Stephen saw God as being Jesus as being on the right hand of God, and that is interpreted in a theological manner that is not consistent with Islam. Nevertheless, Muslims have no difficulty if the disciples of Jesus were given a vision into heaven in which they could see that Jesus is alive and well, he is with God, in which case he's not a false Messiah, he's a true man of God, a prophet, and the Messiah. But then, once that story is told and retold, it takes on physical elements. Jesus now comes into the room where they are, and they feel and touch him. But look at the stories and how they evolve. Mark's Gospel, the earliest of the 4, does not have any such story. There is a promise that Jesus will appear to the disciples, but there is no actual description of the fulfillment of that promise. People felt that Mark's Gospel here suffers a lacuna, and they tried to fill it in by inserting what is now known by scholars to be a false ending to the Gospel according to Mark. And unfortunately, this is in most Bibles that you will read today. The exception is the 1952 edition of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which took these last 12 verses which are now in Mark's Gospel, Mark chapter 16, verses 9 to 20, and relegated them to a footnote at the bottom of the page, so you can read them if you're interested, but it is clear that this is not a part of the original Gospel. But the 1971 edition had to put that back in because of protests from many Christian denominations. People were surprised when they come to that portion of the Bible and find this whole section having been taken out and put down as a footnote. But scholars are very clear, this is not an original part of Mark's Gospel. The later Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, try to give us occasions when Jesus actually appears to his disciples. Now, it is important to notice that the affirmative side, in trying to say that Jesus reappeared to his disciples, have to give us the eyewitness accounts where people actually saw Jesus and recognized him for who he was. But these narratives, striving as they are to give us some narratives that to show us that Jesus did appear to his disciples, in fact, have it that Jesus was not initially recognized. And in fact, in Matthew's Gospel, the doubt remains among some of the disciples to the end. Matthew 28, verse 17, for example. They saw him and they worshipped him, but they doubted. Why did they doubt? And if they doubted, how can we take that as a firm testimony that they actually saw Jesus? Luke's Gospel tries to remove that doubt. Jesus appears to his disciples, they feel and touch him, so eventually there is no doubt. But think about the two on the road to Emmaus. Jesus appears to them, and the way that doubt is removed from their hearts is when they say, didn't we feel a burning in our chest when he spoke to us? So it looks like from the way he broke bread, and this gut feeling that they had, they say this was Jesus who appeared to us on the road. Other than that, they didn't take him to be anything strange. He walked along with them and talked with them. They must have thought he was an ordinary man. The later the gospel, however, the more they try to remove this doubt. But that doubt appears and remains even in the gospel according to John. In the last chapter of the gospel according to John chapter 21, the disciples are there sitting with Jesus and eating breakfast with him, and they dare not ask him who he was because they were sure it was Jesus. That's John's words. But behind these words is the obvious doubt that they had. They're wishing later on, somebody should have asked him, are you really Jesus? But why would they want to even ask that if they recognize him so clearly to be Jesus in the first place? Finally, I should say that there's no good evidence to think that Jesus actually rose from the dead, and I'd like to hear Tony's response to my point. Thank you.
And I'd like to begin the rebuttal period by calling on the Reverend to give a 7-minute speech.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shabir, for a fine presentation. And a couple of points I wanted to raise. You will remember I mentioned 5 basic points that historians and New Testament scholars generally hold about the historical Jesus: the death of Jesus by crucifixion, the honorable burial of Jesus, the discovery of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and the origin of the Christian way. Now, you will notice that Shabir begins by pointing out, and I was quite surprised that he said this, he said that it's heavily disputed that Jesus died. Now, I would challenge Shabir tonight to produce one scholar, just one historian, New Testament scholar, who believes that Jesus swooned on the cross, that he did not really die, that he simply passed out, was rendered unconscious, which is really the view of the Ahmadiyya movement, not the view of classical Islam. Islam has always held classically, traditionally, that Jesus was never crucified to start with. And so I would like to challenge Shabir to produce one scholar that denies that Jesus expired on the cross on that day. In fact, the point is that the overwhelming majority of scholarship is agreed on one indisputable fact, namely that Jesus died. Now, the reason why Shabir wants to preclude the possibility of Jesus dying is very simple. You can't have resurrection without death. If Jesus didn't really die, then he wasn't really raised. But if he did die, if it is the fact that, as the Gospels tell us, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, there's one thing that they're agreed on, and that is that Jesus breathed his last. In fact, if you look at that term, he breathed his last, this is the same construction that is used in the Old Testament where it speaks of the death of Abraham, the death of Isaac, the death of Ishmael, the death of Jacob. The giving of the breath means to expire. Loa and Nita, in their Greek English lexicon, says that the word used by Mark and Luke, expaneo, means to breathe out, to engage in the final act of dying, to die, to breathe out one's last. And they cite Mark 15, verse 37 as proof. You see, the fact of the matter is this, folks. If Jesus of Nazareth did die on the cross, then we've got a problem with Surah 4, Ayah 157. If he did die, then the Quran is wrong on that point. And if it's wrong on that point, then the whole thing necessarily collapses. If Jesus of Nazareth did die, then we've got a serious contradiction in our hands. And folks, it's just a matter of fact. And that is why scholars don't say that Jesus swooned. They don't say that Jesus was rendered unconscious. They unanimously agree, as Robert Funk said, that there is one indisputable fact: Jesus of Nazareth was crucified and put to death by that form. Now, the idea of Gospels evolving, you notice Shabir didn't address the historical consensus here. What he did was he went into each of the Gospels and he tried to show contradictions and tried to say, well, there was an evolution in the text. But notice he never addresses the fact that scholars are still able to retrieve a historical kernel, namely the death of Jesus, his honorable burial, and his discovery of his empty tomb and his post-mortem appearances. And the idea that the Gospels have evolved over time is really a movement in scholarship that is really passé. It's really gone out the window in recent scholarship. Scholars see the Gospels as organizations where the authors would organize their materials for specific audiences. It's not that you have an evolution. Joel Green, an expert in the Gospel of Mark, points out that within the Gospel of Mark, the first Gospel, we have an early high Christology already present, which is what the evolutionary school would say, well, no, you find that in John, you find that much later, but Paul predates all of the Gospels. And he talks about the pre-existent Son of God who was sent into the world. He talks about the darkness that covered the land. Well, a Greek writer by the name of Phlegon and another one by the name of Julius Africanus do mention this event. They talk about this darkness that covered the land during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. We have extra-biblical attestation for this. The appearances of Jesus are also attested not only in the Gospels, but in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul gives us an early testimony of the creed that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried, he was raised, and he appeared. He appeared to Peter. He appeared to the 12. He appeared to 500 at one time. And last of all, Paul says, he appeared to me as one untimely born. And that, of course, confirmed his apostleship. He says that the Gospel of Mark, Pilate is in doubt. He's incredulous that Jesus has died already. The fact of the matter is, Mark was anticipating this very question that Shabir brought up. If you read Mark 15, verses 44 to 45, Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate for permission for the body of Jesus. Pilate is surprised he's already dead, and he has the centurion certify whether or not Jesus is dead. And once he got the report that he was dead, he handed the body over to Joseph of Arimathea for burial. Raymond Brown. What was the title of Raymond Brown's book? Is it The Apparent Death of the Messiah? No, it's The Death of the Messiah. Raymond Brown believed that Jesus died on the cross, not the apparent death of the Messiah. Professor Brown says this in his book: the choice of resurrection language was not inevitability. The early Jews who believed in Jesus, to the contrary, its choice must be explained. For while there was an expectation among Jews of the resurrection of the dead in the last times, there was no expectation of the resurrection of a single man from the dead, separate from and preliminary to the general resurrection. In other words, why did the disciples call it resurrection? Now Shabir says, well, Jesus was exalted, he was ascended into heaven, and he was revealed by God. Well, that's not resurrection, folks. That's what happened to Enoch and Elijah. That's known as assumption, or a translation from an earthly realm into the heavenly realm. But you don't call that a resurrection. A resurrection, by definition, means a rising up again from the dead. And this is what Professor Brown, Raymond Brown, is saying. Why did the disciples call it resurrection if Jesus did not in fact die and was in fact translated into heaven? You see, tearing apart the Scriptures or bringing into question whether they contradict each other still does not address the historical core behind them. And Shabir says in Mark's Gospel, verses 9 to 20 are not part of the original. We've known that, and we accept that fact. And Mark 16, verse 7 presumes the appearances of Jesus. The other man at the tomb says, go to Galilee, he will appear to Peter and to you, and you will meet him there. In Luke 24, he says that Luke removes the doubt of the identity of Jesus. But if you read the passage in context, Luke 24:16, it says that Jesus kept the disciples from recognizing him. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Engaging as usual, just to keep me busy, yes? Well, first of all, Tony is quite right that we have two views here and two sources. Tony depends on the Bible for his information. I depend on the Quran for my information. But I think he's wrong to say that if Jesus died, then the Quran is wrong. Because one should distinguish between the Quranic text and the interpretations that are attached to that Quranic text. Surah 4, verse number 157 does not specifically say literally that Jesus did not die. The common interpretation is that he did not die on the cross and that God raised him to life. God raised him alive to himself. But scholars who have tried to show rapprochement between Islam and Christianity, such as Kenneth Bragg and Jeffrey Parender, in fact have shown that the Quranic text literally does not actually say that Jesus did not die. It is only denying that the Jews, the enemies of him at the time, actually killed him, and specifically by this method of crucifixion. The Quran is not denying point blank altogether that he died, but it is the common interpretation that the Quran denies this. And yes, in that case, the interpretation would be wrong, but not the Quran itself. But I've shown good evidence that in fact the interpretation of that Quranic text is also quite correct in at least saying that Jesus did not die on the cross. There is good evidence in the Gospels, as I've shown, that early on it was known that Jesus did not die on the cross and that he must have died later, and the later Gospels are trying to make it appear that he did die much earlier on the cross itself. But there is one piece of evidence from the Gospels themselves that will show that Jesus did not die, logically. Luke chapter 13, verse number 33, has Jesus saying that he must press on and go to Jerusalem because it is impossible for a prophet to die outside of Jerusalem. Now, John's Gospel is very clear that the cross was affixed outside of Jerusalem. So, logically, if it is impossible for a prophet to die outside of Jerusalem, and if Jesus is a prophet, then logically, he did not die outside of Jerusalem. And if the cross was affixed outside of Jerusalem, then logically, Jesus did not die on the cross. Tony asked me to name one scholar who will dispute that Jesus died on the cross. I should answer that in two parts. The first part, I should say, that no historian, no scholar actually of the New Testament tells us that Jesus survived the crucifixion. They all take it for granted that he died on the cross. However, in dialectical engagement, and this is my second part of the answer, when somebody is saying that Jesus appeared again alive to his disciples, we should be asking, how do we know he was dead in the first place? And if you want me to name a scholar, E.P. Sanders, in his book, Paul, A Short Introduction. E.P. Sanders tells us clearly, today we would wonder, if someone is claiming that Jesus appeared alive to his disciples after his death, we should wonder, how do you know he was dead in the first place? So I'm on very legitimate grounds. Yes, the Ahmadiyya have said that Jesus survived the cross, but they also add that he walked all the way to Kashmir and he died, and in fact, eventually he was buried there. And of course, Sunnis and Ahmadiyyas disagree on the most important point, where they claim their leader to be the second coming of the Messiah. And for that reason, it is convenient for them to have the first Messiah dead and buried. But Sunni Muslims like myself believe that God raised Jesus alive to himself in some mysterious way, and we do not need to know how. It could be somewhere related to what is related in the Gospels, although the Gospels now obviously have exaggerated the story, as I've already shown, as you can tell by the evolution of the Gospels, when we take the story and trace it from one Gospel to another. Or it could be, as mentioned in the classical commentaries, that God raised Jesus alive before he could be put on the cross, in which case someone else looking like Jesus was made to look like Jesus, and that someone was put on the cross. What I think more likely is that Jesus was put on the cross, and I do not feel that the Quran is actually denying this if it is interpreted correctly. In that case, he was put in the tomb still alive, and in some mysterious way, God raised him to himself, and a Muslim does not need to be more specific than this. In that case, there is nothing wrong with the Quran, and in fact the interpretations that have been given to the Quran, in at least saying that Jesus did not die on the cross, I think is on very firm ground. Tony is saying that, well, this could have been falsifiable. But notice that according to the Gospels themselves, the disciples did not reveal to anyone that Jesus had been appearing to them and Jesus was now alive. It is only 50 days after the event that they first make this public. Now, 50 days after the event, would you go open the tomb to try and identify a dead man 2,000 years ago? This was not really falsifiable, as Tony would have us believe. Now, we should make a note here about the use of scholarship. When I refer to Raymond Brown as a Christian scholar who has admitted something in favor of my argument, that does not mean that I have to follow Raymond Brown in everything he says. After all, I'm not a Christian, and I don't subscribe to Christian theology. Raymond Brown will say that Jesus is the Son of God. I do not believe him on these points. What the Christian scholar admits against the prevailing Christian presuppositions is very important for my argument. What he continues to affirm, towing the common line as before, that of course is of very little significance. Tony cannot advance that in his favor because that's a Christian telling us that Christianity is true. But if a Christian scholar is admitting something which would in fact undermine one of the most important beliefs of Christianity, I think that is a very significant point, and this is the reason that I mention it. So I do not have to follow him in everything he says. We should differentiate between fact and interpretation. Facts should be accepted regardless where they come from, whether from Christian, Muslim, or atheist. But the interpretations and the significance of that fact is a different matter. The fact that it is reported that the disciples saw Jesus, that is a fact. There is a report. Two different interpretations have been mentioned tonight. One interpretation is that this was really an appearance of Jesus. Another interpretation is that they were hallucinating. Both have been mentioned here tonight. I'm not going to take the atheist scholar's presupposition that this was a hallucination, nor should I take the Christian scholar's presupposition that this was an actual revelation from God. But coming at it from neutral ground and asking if that is the fact, what explains that fact? And to me, the best explanation for that is that the stories have evolved over time, and the gospel writers have tried to prove that Jesus appeared, whereas in fact the original story does not seem to bear that out. Thank you.
I thank Imam Ali for his remarks. We'll be moving on to the closing statements, and first up will be Reverend Costa, and he'll deliver a reply.
Thank you very much. Again, to draw back to my previous statements that I was making, I don't think tonight that Shabir has provided any good reasons to believe that the historical consensus is in error. He has alluded to the Gospels themselves, and he has tried to argue that there has been an evolutionary development in the narratives of the crucifixion and death of Jesus. But notice what he has not touched on, and that is the grammatical evidence that I put forward to you this evening, and that is that the language that is used in the Gospels are the typical language used of people when they die, when they expire, when they give up the ghost, when they yield up their spirit. And the real fact of the matter here is this, folks, and I have to bring this. This is really the Achilles heel. If Jesus really did die on that cross, then Surah 4, Ayah 157, is wrong. And that's the real fact of the matter here tonight. And that's why I think Shabir is really trying to evade this issue of the death of Jesus. Let me say a few other things. The Surah 4, Ayah 157 is a very vague passage, and even Imam Ali has mentioned that, he's admitted that, actually in the past few nights he's admitted that. It's a very vague passage. It has subjected itself to a number of interpretations where some say it was Judas who was crucified instead of Christ, others think it was a rabbi, others think it was Simon the Cyrene who carried the cross, etc., etc. The fact of the matter is, why is it that the death of Jesus is such an issue? Because the average response is, well, God would not allow a noble servant like Jesus to suffer such an agonizing death. But I call you to account to the fact that in the Quran, in Surah 4, Ayah 155, and Surah 5, Ayah 70, Allah had sent prophets, many messengers, many of whom were slain, persecuted, killed by those that opposed them. And if we do not make a difference among the prophets, as Muslims contend, we make no distinction among the prophets, then why is it that Jesus gets away scot-free here? And all these other prophets in the past were slain by those to whom they were sent. Shabir mentions E.P. Sanders. I would be very excited to read that source, Shabir. If you have that quote by E.P. Sanders where he actually doubts the death of Jesus, I'll be very interested to read that and get that source from you. The idea that Jesus really didn't die and he later appeared to his disciples, this also smacks of a deception on the part of God, that God made the disciples think that Jesus was risen from the dead, when in fact he wasn't. Because the language that the early Christians used was the following. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 4, Paul is passing on what he received, a very early creed that goes back, by many scholar standards, to the early Jerusalem church. And the creed goes like this. Paul says, I passed on to you what I received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised again on the third day according to the Scriptures. A number of scholars have traced this creed within 5 years of the death of Jesus. Folks, that is incredible timing. Within 5 years of the death of Jesus, there was a creed pronounced among Christians that Jesus died for our sins, that he was buried, that he was raised, and that he appeared. And what is Paul doing? He is giving us in capsule form what you find in the Gospels. Jesus died, he was buried, and he was raised, and he appeared to his followers. The idea that Raymond Brown is a Christian, and therefore Raymond Brown has to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he has to believe in the resurrection. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that's a bit of a genetic fallacy there. But when you consider the fact that other scholars who are not Christians, let's say Jewish scholars, particularly Professor Pinchas Lapid, who is now deceased, professor in the University of Germany, or Professor Geza Vermes from Oxford University, the specialist in the Dead Sea Scrolls, both of these Jewish scholars have accepted the historical reality of the empty tomb of Jesus. And Professor Lapid even wrote a book, The Resurrection of Jesus, A Jewish Perspective, in which he goes into great detail and he concludes that, yes, the God of Israel raised Jesus from the dead, so that through him the knowledge of the God of Israel would go out into the Gentiles. A rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi, saying something like this. And that's why I wish tonight we had a rabbi up here on the stage so I could share this with him. And so really what we have to explain here tonight is, what is the best explanation for the origin of the Christian movement? Why did the Christian movement preach Jesus was raised when in fact he wasn't? Did Jesus delude them into thinking that? Did God delude them into thinking that? Consider the fact that in the Gospel of Mark, Rudolf Pesch argues that in chapters 14 to 16, we have what's called a pre-Markan passion narrative that goes way back to as far as 37 of the Common Era, within 4 years of the actual events. And so I would submit to you tonight that God raised Jesus from the dead is the best explanation for the facts.
Costa for his remarks and call upon Imam Ali to give his closing argument for 5 minutes.
Thank you again, Tony. Very engaging indeed. The quote from E.P. Sanders is in an Oxford University Press publication. Paul, a very short introduction. The page number out here. Now, he says that Raymond Brown does not necessarily have to believe in the resurrection as a Christian scholar. I highly doubt that. I doubt that one who denies the resurrection of Jesus will be considered by Tony to be a genuine Christian scholar. As for these Jewish scholars who agree that Jesus was raised by God back from the dead, I'd really like to ask Tony in reverse that he should share with me that information. We have to learn from each other. I'd like to see why these Jewish scholars would say that Jesus resurrected from the dead and still not become Christians. Because the whole premise of Judaism is that Judaism is true, and if a Messiah comes and he's crucified, well then he dies an accursed death, as Tony said earlier. And if he does die an accursed death, well then we cannot believe in him as a true Messiah, and we remain Jews. But if we are to believe in him as a true Messiah, how can we remain Jews? There seems to be a conundrum there that I need to investigate, and Tony, please give me those references. Thank you. And now, Tony spoke about Mark chapter 16, verse 7, which indicates that Jesus will in fact appear to his disciples. That is the point. At the early stage, you just have a proclamation, okay, he will appear, but no actual story showing that he did appear, and then others come in later on and invent the story that he did appear. So you have somebody, first of all, making a suggestion, and then somebody inventing the story to prove that the suggestion was correct. But even that suggestion is thought not to have appeared in the pre-Markan Passion narrative. Tony, according to Dr. Raymond Brown, that passage, Mark chapter 16, verse 7, is of doubtful and dubious origin. But even the pre-Markan Passion narrative, that does not mean that Muslims have to accept that. You see, Muslims want to make sure that if something was said by Jesus, there were his actual disciples who memorized that or wrote it down and then passed it on to people whom they met. And we should have a continuous link of persons, one to another, who have passed on this information. But if you say that before Mark wrote, there was some pre-Markan Passion narrative, and Mark based his narrative on that one, so who wrote that pre-Markan Passion narrative? Where is it? Whoever saw it? Who defined its outlines? It is not known. Scholars are working backwards and saying, if Mark wrote it this way, it looks like the terminology is such that it must have been fixed before he got it, and he just got it and made some further insertions into it. Well, that means he had a gospel of some sort to which he was making changes, and we don't have the original one, and we don't know where it originated, and so on. So So that does not become dependable information. The fact that I say that Mark is the earliest gospel among the four, that means it is in some respects more dependable than the other three. It doesn't mean that this is the most dependable gospel ever. It is possible that we'll find a pre-Markan gospel. It is possible that we'll find a pre-Markan gospel as well. That has to be kept in the back of our minds. I believe Tony has not really heard my last presentation, because I just explained that Surah 4 verse 157 does not specifically say that Jesus did not die. He came back and insisted that, yeah, the 4:51-57 says that, and if it's proven that Jesus died, then that verse is wrong. The verse doesn't actually say that. The verse says, Ma qataluhu, they killed him not. Ma salabuhu, they crucified him not. And then in the end it says, Wa ma qataluhu yaqina, they did not kill him for certain. So it's they. They did not kill him. They did not crucify him. They did not kill him for certain. It is not absolutely declaring that Jesus did not die. In fact, there are other passages of the Quran which has been interpreted by some Muslim scholars as indicating that Jesus died for a few hours and then God raised him to himself. And this is found in the commentary of Ibn Kathir on the verse number 3, verse number 55. So of course the Gospels say that he died. But as I'm saying, Tony does not need to prove that. The Gospels say that he died, and the later the Gospel, the more it goes out of its way to prove that he died. But we can see that these later attempts are really invented stories. That is not the original story about Jesus. The original story about Jesus left it such that there was some great doubt as to whether he died on the cross. In fact, there would have been a presumption that he didn't die so soon and that he was taken down. This is why the Jewish scholars went into Pilate's court, according to Matthew's Gospel, and they said, seal up the tomb, lest the disciples should steal him away and then tell everyone he rose from the dead, and then the second deception would be worse than the first. What was the first deception? The first deception was that they went away to observe their Sabbath, thinking that the legs of the crucified victims would be broken, thus hastening their death. And they later on found out that the legs of everyone else was broken, but not those of Jesus. So again, we must ask with Raymond Brown, what really caused the death of Jesus? It looks like these Jewish scholars are realizing, wait a minute, we have been deceived. Then they said, seal up the tomb. But nobody said that they actually checked the tomb to see if the body was still there. Thank you.
A lot more people here than like. Now we go. Alright, so thanks so much to both of you guys for two very powerful presentations. You know what? These two guys have been doing presentations at a few schools in the last few days, and they must be beat. They've been taking time out of their professional lives, and if I'm not mistaken, tonight's the last one, right? Yeah, so let's have another round of applause for them.